If you've ever been on any sports team, you know that having a competition outside of your community is a pretty big deal. Bigger if you need to charter a plane to attend the match. And that excitement is exactly what the rugby players of the Old Christians Club rugby union team from the Montevideo, Uruguay, were feeling as they flew out of the Carrasco International Airport on the 12th of October 1972. The team headed to Santiago, Chile, aboard a chartered Uruguayan Air Force twin turboprop Fairchild FH-227D named FAU-571 for a match against an English rugby team, the Old Boys Club in Santiago, but they never arrived. After a weather-induced 24 hours delay in their flight map, the 5 crew members and 40 passengers, including the rugby team, their friends and family, and other passengers of the FAU-571 were about halfway to Chile on the 13th of October 1972 with high cheerful spirits until disaster struck in the form of an inexperienced, miscalculating pilot, terrible weather, and the Andes Mountains. Join us as we take you through the tragic but hope-filled story of a Rugby team's plane crash in the Andes. Please be cautious of the following trigger warnings: details of severe injury, starvation, and flesh-eating practices. Ready to slay through the snow-covered mountains of the Andes and uncover the true events that inspired the movie Alive and several books? Let's start from the beginning. Here is everything we know about the true story behind a rugby team's plane crash in the Andes. The crash. When the passengers aboard FAU-571 had to delay their trip by a few hours, it didn't seem to be a problem. After all, everyone understands how the weather can switch up without sufficient notice. The next day, 13th of October 1972, the passengers continued on their journey, piloted by Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, who was an experienced Air Force pilot with about 5,000 flying hours under his belt, and co-piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Laguarara, who was under training from the colonel. As they flew towards Santiago, the clouds got thicker due to the cold temperature, and a major part of the Andes Mountains was hidden from sight. Pilot Ferradas had completed 29 trips across the Andes before this trip, but rather unfortunately, co-pilot Laguarara was the one actively flying the plane as they moved around the mountains. The plan was to get past the mountains, turn the aircraft north, and then initiate descent to the Pudahuel Airport, located in Santiago. But nothing went according to plan. While they communicated with the air traffic control via radio, the pilots didn't have clear views to correctly determine their location and measure distance. Pilot Laguarara informed the air traffic controllers that they were clear of the mountains, when in fact, they had been flying right over the mountains. Without visual confirmation, the controllers relied on the information provided and gave their clear for the descent process to begin. And that's where everything went wrong, literally. Unbeknownst to the passengers, who had simply been informed to fasten up against turbulence, the pilot had turned way too early, at about twice the degree he should have, and was heading straight for the mountains. That single mistake would lead to days, weeks, months, and years of grief, suffering, and disaster. One of the rugby players noticed this first, and he shouted that they were flying too close to the mountains. The next events happened in an agonizingly slow time frame. The first week. When the aircraft crashed, it hit a snowbank, which caused the seats to push forward. This impact led to the death of several passengers and severe injuries to their lower bodies, especially the legs of many others. 45 people were aboard the plane, but after the initial chaos, 5 were dead and 7 were missing, later found dead at different spots, some buried in the thick snow around the mountain. Within an hour after the flight went off the radar, a rescue team was dispatched to search the last reported location of the aircraft. The survivors who were alive and able tried to make signs to get the rescue party to spot them amidst the thick white snow and high mountains, but it proved futile. During that first night, the harsh cold, severe injuries, and the seemingly helpless situation took the lives of another 5 passengers, including Graziella Mariani, who had bought a seat on the flight so she could attend her oldest daughter's wedding in Chile. In the first week post-crash, the 27 passengers who were alive and minimally uninjured cared for each other, and they had makeshift shelter by ripping apart the remnants of the crashed plane and sorting through everything edible. At the end of the first week, they had found a way to make water by melting snow. They skinned the plane's seats to create blankets, and made sunglasses from plastic they found, and built hammocks for the survivors who had broken legs. From a rugby team excitedly heading to a match with their friends and family in tow, a wrong turn and terrible decision had given them a new uniform identity: survivors. The harsh reality of survival. Over the next few days after the crash, the survivors found a one-way listen-only radio that helped them keep abreast of information surrounding their situation, and that's how they learned that their rescue search had been stopped. The authorities decided that the possibility of survival was minimal, and it would be easier to find the dead bodies in the summer when the snow had melted. Unknown to the authorities, family, and friends of the players, 27 survivors had now been rendered completely desolate, hopeless, and helpless. It seemed like all hope was lost, but one of the rugby team players, Gustavo Nikolic, told them that it simply meant they had to find their way out of the disaster on their own. His words inspired and brought some positivity to the desolate minds. But unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to see if he was right or not. 17 days had passed since the crash when an avalanche struck the aircraft that housed the sleeping survivors. The impact of the avalanche killed 8 people. This included Gustavo Nikolic, Marcelo Perez, the team captain, who had taken up the role as a leader throughout their survival, and Liliana Methol, the last surviving female passenger. The avalanche had filled the fuselage, keeping the survivors trapped inside the craft with limited room and air for 3 days. Now their food supply had run out after that first week of being stuck on the mountain, and as they grew weaker, the only resolution was the worst thing any of them would ever consider. After a lot of conviction, the survivors began to eat the preserved bodies of their dead teammates, friends, and other passengers. According to Roberto Canessa, one of the rugby players and survivors, in an interview with National Geographic, they had all made a pact that if they died, they'd be happy to put their bodies to service of the rest of the team. This act of survival, which would be vaguely referred to as cannibalism in the media coverage and reports that followed their eventual rescue, was actually anthropophagy. They hadn't killed the people they ate, only relied on their dead bodies for survival. Roberto Canessa, who is now a renowned pediatric cardiologist, was a medical student at the time, and he was one of the 2 young men who made the harrowing trip that brought about their rescue 72 days after the crash, with only 16 people remaining alive. The rescue. After over 2 months of living through the worst nightmare anyone could have, 3 of the rugby players decided to explore the mountains further in search of rescue. Nando Parrado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vicentin spent 10 days trekking and climbing, without any proper gear or clothing, through the Andes in search of a trail or any sign of life and humanity. Vicentin returned to their base at the crash site, while Parrado and Canessa spent another couple of days traveling through different paths out of the mountains. Finally, 69 days after the rugby team's plane crashed in the Andes, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa found a river where they settled for the evening. Later that evening, they saw 3 men riding on horseback across the river. They shouted out to the men, and with the promise of returning the next day, the men acknowledged their presence and left. With information about the crash and passengers who got missing for over 2 months, Sergio Catalan, one of the men on horseback, rode to inform the police and get help. Other men carried the exhausted players back to civilization. Within the next 24 hours, the news had broken out to the international media, and rescue teams came to transport the survivors in batches. On the 23rd of December 1972, the last of the survivors were rescued, and thus began their new lease on life. As they shared accounts of their struggles and experience, the survivors met with backlash on their flesh-eating survival methods at first. However, when the reverence attached to the act was emphasized, the public was more understanding. Final thoughts. Since their rescue, nearly 50 years ago, several books have been written, some by the survivors themselves. Movies and documentaries have been made, and there are yearly trips to the site of the crash, where most of the bodies remain buried. The rugby team was headed for a match out of their hometown, but what they met was a lifetime worth of nightmares in the Andes Mountains. That's all we have on the true story behind a rugby team's plane crash in the Andes. What do you think about their ordeal? Was their survival anything but a miracle? Do let us know in the comments section below. Remember to hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to our channel, and smash that notification bell. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.